The chime of steel on steel rang out with a repetition and speed that was familiar to the surroundings of Vielin. The weaponsmith was at work. Although competent in making the mundane, her true skill set was blade work. Her husband approached with a cup. She took it from him and poured it over her head. As she passed it back to him, he had a glint in his eye. She loved that look, even after all these years. She handed it back to him. He took it and went and gathered her a second cup. This was a routine in their relationship. The first drink was water, the second, stem nectar, which she sculled in one gulp. As she handed him back the cup so she could get back to work, the glint in his eye had made its way to his cheeky smile hiding behind his thick beard. It made her feel giddy. He was the only man that could ever do that. Most men feared the smith. Her massive muscular physique and fiery temper put off all of them. But the first time her husband had seen her, he had always looked at her in this way. It hadn't abated with time either. She looked down at the stump where his arm used to be, and anger and sadness filled her. He saw this and moved to her. The one-armed man threw the cup down and reached behind her neck and pulled her in for a kiss. He then rested his forehead against hers, staring intently into her eyes, and with a fire he said, "Wouldn't change anything." He let her go so she could go back to work and went and retrieved the cup he had discarded. She watched him go. The smith started back at her work, and soon enough the ringing of the hammer echoed over the town of Vielin once again. As steel struck steel, she thought about how her husband had lost his arm those years ago. She struck it harder. They had been commissioned by a merchant to make a dagger. It was unusual in that it required a metal hilt with engravings on it. She cared not for the design, but the price the man was willing to pay was worth the effort. The merchant would not be back to town for a while, however, and had requested the dagger be delivered to his place in Soror. Not trusting a messenger to take the weapon or return the resulting silver, her husband sought out the hire of a horse. The stable owner had thought them rubes, and instead of selling them a decent horse, bought out an untrained beast. Her husband was a competent rider, she had seen it, and he jumped up in the saddle to get a feel for the horse before they purchased it. As her husband was riding it around the yard, it seemed unsettled. Suddenly it reared up, throwing her husband off. Once he hit the ground, the horse ran in a panic, treading on his arm and breaking it. The stable owner blamed the accident on her husband, and even had the audacity to suggest that they should pay for the horse that mangled her husband's arm. Instead of being able to travel to Soror to collect their money, they had to stay in Vielin and seek medical treatment from the young priestess. She was forced to amputate his arm but saved his life. The smith thanks the goddess Lilith every day for that miracle. They sent a letter to the merchant, who thankfully made a special trip to Vielin to collect the dagger. He did not even try and readjust the price. Then suddenly some movement in the corner of her eye grabbed her attention. She looked up to see the stable owner's son walking, giggling and flirting with the lord's daughter. It was no secret the lord's daughter courted half the young men in town, but then a moment happened. A moment that could give the smith some vengeance for what the stable owner did to her man. The young couple stopped in the street. The smith watched. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but their movements made it plain and simple. They stood facing each other. The boy looked at the lord's daughter in surprise. She giggled and nodded. He looked down at her belly. He reached down and touched her belly. They cuddled and kept walking, oblivious to the fact that she knew their secret. The lord's unmarried daughter was pregnant, and the stable owner's son was the father. Well, the smith thought, musing about the girl's promiscuity through the town, the stable owner's son might be the father.